the secret history of the nuclear torpedo that can wipe out coastlines. Why would a nuclear power build a Doomsday torpedo instead of more missiles? Most people assume missile shields killed nothing but budgets, but Poseidon aims at something those shields can't touch. It threatens entire coastlines and the economies behind them while slipping under the radar, literally. There's a secret lineage here, Soviet doomsday thinking that evolved into a modern Russian answer to a deterrence gap. You'll get the history, the tech, the strategy, and the one thing everyone keeps getting wrong, plus the specific playbook that turns uncertainty into leverage. And there's a flaw navies don't want to talk about. We'll hit that later. First, to understand why Poseidon exists, start with the Soviets. The seed, Soviet doomsday thinking. Here's what actually happened. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was racing to build credible ways to hit the United States. Andrei Sakharov, yes, the physicist who later won the Nobel Peace Prize, helped conceive a weapon called the T-15, a gigantic nuclear torpedo carried by a submarine meant to detonate in or near a harbor. The logic was blunt. Ports are economic choke points. Destroy New York, Norfolk, or San Diego, and you don't just wreck a pier, you rupture the bloodstream of a nation's logistics. On paper, T felt like a shortcut to parity. In practice, it collided with physics and steel. The torpedo would have consumed so much space that a submarine could carry essentially one shot. The size limited maneuverability, handling, and reliability. Meanwhile, submarine-launched ballistic missiles were improving fast. SLBMs offered standoff range, quicker time to target, and a more survivable second strike posture. Naval planners looked at the trade, a single ungainly harbor buster versus multiple missiles from a patrol box. The T-15 lost. But the idea didn't vanish. It mutated into strategy. The Soviets developed a mindset of assured retaliation even if command collapsed, what the West later called perimeter or dead hand. The goal was psychological as much as physical. Convince adversaries that any decapitation attempt would still trigger catastrophic response. That required survivability, redundancy, and automation. You see the seeds of Poseidon here, not as a first-strike marvel, but as a weapon designed to survive chaos and still matter. Soviet vulnerability fed the mindset. Much of the USSR's population and industry sat near navigable waterways, and its sea access depended on choke points NATO could threaten. In a shooting war, ports, naval bases, and coastal infrastructure would be prime targets. The Soviets internalized a port-centric targeting logic because ports concentrate high-value assets, fuel farms, container yards, repair docks, railheads, and command nodes within blast distance. Break those, and you don't just kill ships, you halt mobilization. There was also a civil defense reality. Early Cold War shelters didn't scale for sustained port operations under nuclear attack. You could harden silos and bunkers, but you couldn't harden a harbor. A nuclear emplacement in a harbor isn't just about blast. The contamination and debris turn the environment into a long-term operational hazard. Again, you can hear the future Poseidon argument forming. Durable disruption beats instant destruction when the goal is to paralyze capacity. As SLBMs matured, T-15's appeal faded. Submarines like the Hotel and later the Delta and Typhoon classes turned into real second strike platforms. The Soviet Navy invested in ballistic and cruise missiles, layered defenses, and quieting tech. The Doomsday torpedo receded into the background, a relic of a time before missiles became reliable and precise. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Budgets cratered, fleets rusted at piers, and trained crews left. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia's navy declined across the board. Nuclear submarines sat half-maintained, new construction slowed to a crawl. At the same time, the United States poured resources into missile defense research and deployed Aegis systems across a growing fleet. Whether or not those defenses could stop a full-scale Russian strike was less important than the perception they could erode Russia's deterrent edge. That perception matters. Deterrence is a mind game anchored to capabilities. If your adversary believes their first salvo might be blunted, and your own aging SSBN force might be tracked or attrited early, pressure builds to field something that can bypass those defenses entirely. Here, the old Soviet logic, assured retaliation under chaos, meets a new asymmetric instinct. Go underwater, go slow, go survivable, and target what can't be shielded. Ports and coastal infrastructure don't come with ABM umbrellas. A device that can loiter quietly and strike weeks later doesn't need a launch alert. It just needs to show it can get there. There's also the theater-level effect. A weapon that threatens coastlines forces an adversary to protect thousands of miles of shore, not a handful of missile fields. That's an expensive, sensor-heavy, politically complicated problem. Even if you never fire, you're taxing the other side's budget and attention. Again, that's very Soviet. Impose cost, create dilemmas, and lean on fear. Psychologically, a weapon like Poseidon tallies with the perimeter mindset. You don't need flawless command links if the platform can execute pre-programmed logic. You don't need a city-busting airburst if you can make a port unusable for months. And you don't need extreme accuracy if your target is a harbor basin where the water amplifies the mess. The threat is credible because it exploits geography and infrastructure rather than exquisite timing. So why didn't the Soviets just keep T-15? Because their missiles got good. Why revisit the idea now? Because Russia's missiles are still lethal, but the context shifted. Constrained forces, perceived missile defenses, and a desire to stress NATO in an arena where the West must spend heavily to keep up. Poseidon fits that gap. It's a hedge against disarmament fantasies, a leverage tool in crises, and a reminder that the ocean is the biggest maneuver space on Earth. Everything changes when a navy believes a single autonomous system could force insurers to freeze trade and ports to go dark. That's the real echo of Soviet doomsday thinking, deterrence by making the cost of miscalculation obvious and unbearable. And it's why the next chapter starts with a leak everyone was meant to see. From collapse to asymmetry, why Poseidon exists. When the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian Navy didn't just shrink, it hollowed out. Submarines tied up at piers for years became parts donors. Crews left for civilian work. The shipyards that once pushed out ballistic missile subs turned into repair shops struggling to keep legacy hulls alive. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, patrol rates dropped, training cycles stretched, and the Bastion strategy in the Barents and Okhotsk looked more like hope than doctrine. Now put that against what the United States was building. Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers spread across the fleet. SM-3 interceptors matured. Ground-based mid-course defenses appeared in Alaska and California. Whether those systems could defeat a concentrated Russian ICBM salvo wasn't the point. They created a narrative. The West was investing in missile defenses, while Russia's sea-based deterrent, older Delta IVs with aging missiles, few new Boré boats entering service, looked thinner. In deterrence, perception shapes decision-making. If leaders worry that a first strike could be blunted, they look for options that bypass the shield entirely. That's where asymmetry comes in. Instead of racing dollar for dollar on missile accuracy and penetration aids, you pivot to a domain the defenses don't cover. Underwater, there's no ABM. There are sonars, patrols, and networks, but they're patchy and political. You can't ring an entire continent with persistent undersea interceptors. You can't build a radar dome over every harbor. If you can field a system that's nuclear-powered, autonomous, and able to loiter at depth, you force your rival to protect thousands of miles of coastline and hundreds of critical nodes. LNG terminals, naval bases, container hubs, fuel depots, and choke point straits. Arms control reinforced the incentive. Treaty ceilings capped deployed strategic warheads and launchers. Russia retained potent ICBMs, but the number of quiet, modern SSBNs lagged. Precision conventional strike from the U.S., Tomahawk waves, stealth aircraft, and later hypersonic torque fueled a Russian fear of a disarming conventional attack on fixed command and control and submarine bases. If your submarines are at risk in port and your missile fields could be degraded, a survivable, hard-to-find underwater system becomes attractive. It doesn't need a satellite uplink in wartime. It doesn't broadcast a launch plume, it just moves. There's also messaging power. Poseidon says, in plain language, you can't contain this with your current defenses. It threatens what the United States actually lives on: maritime trade. Smash a port, and you don't just break a pier. You jam rail links, delay energy imports, spike insurance rates, and ripple supply chains. Even the rumor of deployment can push insurers to raise premiums or exclude coverage for certain approaches. That's leverage before detonation, which is the sweet spot for coercion. Domestically, the project served multiple masters. Budgets were tight, but prestige programs that promised strategic payoff got oxygen. A nuclear-powered UUV plays to Russia's engineering identity: reactors, titanium hulls, deep-diving special mission subs. It also gives the Navy and strategic forces a banner capability that can be showcased without showing too much. When you can display a large weapon body, a special-purpose carrier like Belgorod, and a tantalizing slide of specifications, you create political capital at home and anxiety abroad. Critically, Poseidon fits into Russia's layered deterrence narrative. At the top sits the assured second strike from ICBMs and SLBMs. Below that, theater nuclear options, dual-capable missiles, and air-delivered weapons. Poseidon adds a survivable, time-flexible threat against coastal infrastructure. It can be prepositioned, routed along odd paths, and held in reserve as a bargaining chip. In a crisis, you don't need to escalate to city-killing strikes. You can threaten to render one harbor unusable for months. That's a more calibrated nuclear message, still horrific, but framed as hitting military economic arteries rather than civilian population centers. This is important because escalation management is the modern game. Russia wants tools that complicate NATO planning without forcing immediate nuclear exchange. A system that can't be intercepted by ABM, that exploits gaps in undersea surveillance, and that targets high-leverage infrastructure checks those boxes. It also puts pressure on allied politics. Governors, mayors, port authorities, and insurers become stakeholders in national security decisions. That widens the pressure arc beyond defense ministries. You can see why this isn't just a science project. It's a strategic hedge against perceived US advantages in missile defense and precision strike. It's a cost-imposing move that drags the West into expensive seabed sensing, and it's a bargaining tool designed to work in the space between conventional war and Armageddon. The ocean is the world's biggest concealment terrain. If you can weaponize patience, slow, deep, quiet, you change your adversary's playbook. And that's the context that makes what happened next feel deliberate, not accidental. Russia needed the world to know a system like this existed without proving every detail. So one afternoon, a camera in a Kremlin meeting caught a slide it shouldn't have, clear, framed, and aimed at analysts everywhere. The televised accident, Poseidon's first reveal. Here's the scene. November 2015, a Kremlin meeting with military brass. Cameras roll for the evening news, and for a few seconds a staffer's binder sits open just right. On the page, a legible diagram labeled Status 6, an unmanned, nuclear-powered undersea system with intercontinental range. The shot lingers long enough for foreign analysts to freeze frame, translate, and circulate. Accident. The framing, clarity, and timing said otherwise. Why stage it? Because ambiguity is a weapon. Russia wanted the idea planted. There's a system that doesn't care about missile shields and doesn't follow ballistic trajectories. The slide conveniently showed the parts Western audiences couldn't ignore, range measured in thousands of kilometers, operating depths beyond most anti-submarine weapons, and speeds that imply a pump jet or exotic propulsion. It even teased the word cobalt, a nod to salted, warhead lore designed to amplify fear. That single word did more work in headlines than any white paper could. Now, this is important because the details straddled signal and noise. The signal was the concept, a nuclear-powered autonomous torpedo drone with strategic reach. The noise lived in the theatrics, perfectly legible specs that might reflect aspirations, not realities. Range, plausible when you carry a compact reactor. Depth, Russia has decades of deep-diving experience with special mission subs. Speed, high bursts are conceivable, but sustained sprinting would compromise stealth and endurance. cobalt. It's a psychological accelerant, not a doctrinal necessity. Analysts pulled the slide apart. Intercontinental routing implies months underwater and navigation that doesn't depend on satellites. That fits with Russian investment in inertial systems and seabed mapping. Deep operation suggests a design shaped to survive pressure and stay under most shipping noise. And the Warhead callouts pointed to a large diameter hull, bigger than any standard torpedo, so you're not talking about a tactical weapon. You're in strategic payload territory, aimed at ports and coastal nodes. But here's where it gets interesting. By accidentally revealing Status 6, Russia gained two advantages without testing in the open. First, it forced every navy to ask whether their undersea awareness could catch something slow, deep, and autonomous. Second, it created a bargaining chip. You don't need full operational capability to change calculus. You need plausible capability and a reputation for following through. The slide offered both. Western media latched onto the radioactive tsunami angle. That phrase travels fast. It also muddies the water. The idea of engineered megawaves oversells the physics and undersells the real threat. Long-term port denial from contamination, debris, and economic shock. The Kremlin didn't mind the confusion. Fear is leverage, and messy narratives keep opponents guessing about yield, burst depth, and employment doctrine. Inside Russia, the leaks signaled progress without inviting hard verification. We have a new category of deterrent, the message read, and it goes under your radar. It boosted the prestige of special-purpose platforms like Belgorod and the design bureaus behind them. It also bought time. While foreign outlets debated cobalt and cartoonish wave heights, engineers could iterate propulsion, guidance, and launch concepts away from daily scrutiny. Everything changes when you realize the reveal wasn't about specs, it was about audiences. NATO planners got a problem set. Insurers and port authorities got a nightmare. Arms controllers got a classification puzzle. And the public got a simple storyline. There's a Doomsday torpedo out there, and it swims past your defenses. Set aside the theater, though. To judge the threat, you've got to understand the machine itself, what powers it, how it navigates, and what it can realistically do underwater. How Poseidon works, the nuclear-powered torpedo drone. Here's what you need to know. Poseidon isn't a torpedo in the traditional sense. It's a very large, autonomous underwater vehicle designed for strategic effect. Think of a cigar-shaped hull several meters in diameter, long enough to house a compact reactor, shielding, propulsion machinery, guidance systems, and a large nuclear warhead. It isn't meant to chase a frigate. It's meant to navigate oceans, loiter, and arrive at a harbor or coastal approach on its own timeline. Start with propulsion. The core is a compact, fast reactor, likely a liquid metal or pressurized water design optimized for high power density and long endurance. The reactor's heat drives a steam cycle that spins a turbine coupled to a pump jet. Pump jets are chosen for efficiency and lower cavitation at moderate speeds, trading top-end sprint for quieter cruise. The reactor doesn't need refueling for the mission. The constraint is component reliability and thermal management, not energy. That's why interoceanic range becomes plausible. With careful speed control and power management, it can run for months underwater. Guidance is where the autonomy matters. Poseidon can't rely on GPS once submerged, so it starts with high-grade inertial navigation. Ring laser or fiber optic gyros paired with accelerometers, corrected occasionally by surfacing under cloud cover or referencing celestial fixes via periscope-like masts, if doctrine allows. More realistically, it leans on terrain contour navigation, matching onboard bathymetric maps to real-time sonar returns, comparing seabed features, slopes, and canyons to a stored atlas. Russia has decades of deep ocean mapping from its special mission fleet, and that data feeds autonomy. Add impossible acoustic beacons, seabed transponders placed along routes, to bound drift without broadcasting a detectable signal. The autonomy stack tiers up. Mission-level planning to hit waypoints, mid-level behaviors to dodge obstacles and avoid shipping lanes, and low-level control that manages buoyancy, trim, and energy. Endurance unlocks routing. Poseidon can take polar paths beneath ice, ride thermoclines to mask its noise, or hug complex continental shelves where seabed clutter and biological noise hide it. It can loiter offshore, wait for a trigger condition, then creep inward along dredged channels that lead directly to target basins. This time flexibility is the point. No launch plume, no boost phase detection, just a slow approach that expands the defender's search area to absurd scale. What launches it? Two purpose-built vectors dominate the open record: the converted special mission submarine Belgorod and the follow-on Khabarovsk class. Belgorod is enormous, designed to carry multiple Poseidon bodies in external or semi-external tubes integrated into the hull. Khabarovsk appears to be a more dedicated carrier with internal magazines. There's also chatter about seabed containers, encapsulated launch canisters pre-positioned on the ocean floor. Technically possible, but operationally risky. Maintenance, command assurance, and treaty optics get thorny fast. A submarine launch preserves mobility and political control while keeping maintenance crews nearby. Command and control is deliberately constrained. In peacetime, limited acoustic communications can update mission parameters at low data rates, short messages, authentication codes, and aborts. In crisis or wartime, you can't assume persistent comms. That's why pre-programmed logic dominates: multiple contingency branches that respond to timeouts, geofence triggers, or loss of contact with a carrier sub. Positive control versus autonomy is the tightrope. You want assurance the weapon won't wander or be spoofed, but you also want it to execute if higher command is disrupted. Expect layered failsafes, arming keys tied to route completion, multi-factor environmental checks, and time-locked sequences that prevent premature activation. Now, noise and hydrodynamics. The hull form must balance internal volume with drag management. A broad, blunt cylinder wastes energy. A carefully faired nose, blended pump jet shroud, and fairings over control surfaces reduce flow separation. Internal isolation mounts and coolant flow smoothing reduce tonal signatures from the reactor and turbines. It still makes noise, everything does, but at the right speed bands and depths, that noise can sit under ambient, distant shipping, wave noise refracted by thermoclines, and biological activity. The reactor allows very slow, very steady cruise, acoustically friendly. Bursts of speed are reserved for terminal runs or evasion, where stealth is already compromised. Sensors are minimalist, but mission-focused. Forward-looking sonars map ahead and downscan for seabed features. Side arrays help maintain lateral separation from slopes and man-made structures. Basic electronic support measures are plausible near the surface for sniffing active sonars or AIS emissions, but emissions control rules keep Poseidon passive. Internally, health monitoring is constant. Reactor temperatures, vibration spectra, bearing wear proxies, and radiation levels. Any out-of-family signature triggers self-preservation behaviors, slowing down, changing depth, or parking in a quiet pocket to cool and reassess. Warhead integration dictates hull diameter. Reports suggest a very large yield package with robust environmental hardening to survive long-duration saltwater immersion and pressure cycles. That means dedicated shock mounting, redundant environmental seals, and periodic housekeeping routines, thermal cycling, moisture scavenging, and diagnostic checks. The interface between the warhead and the autopilot includes arming logic that waits for a narrow envelope of location, depth, and timing, plus authentication pathways that require multiple internal confirmations before the final commit. Deployment concepts vary. One model: a carrier sub releases Poseidon in friendly bastions, then returns to patrol. The UUV proceeds alone. Another: the carrier escorts at distance, providing occasional acoustic updates from safe waters before the drone departs on its final leg. A third: deterrence signaling, simply puts a carrier to sea with publicly hinted payloads, letting uncertainty drive political effects without any launch. All of this sounds sleek on a slide, but the constraints are real. Saltwater corrosion, biofouling, navigation drift over months, and cumulative mechanical wear are stubborn. That's why engineering choices tilt conservative. Cruise slow, avoid unnecessary maneuvers, and use the ocean's physics as camouflage. The reactor gives endurance, but discipline provides survivability. And once you accept it's a patient machine, not a speedster, the strategy around it starts to make sense. Speed, depth, and detectability, the physics that matter. Most people jump to supercavitation. Here, rocket a bubble around the hull and fly underwater. That's not Poseidon's game. Supercavitation is loud, unstable, and power-hungry. It makes sense for a sprinting, short-range weapon, not a months-long, covert transit. A pump jet paired with a reactor favors steady, laminar flow at modest speeds. Less cavitation means fewer broadband spikes in the acoustic spectrum and a better chance of hiding under ambient noise. Quiet wins. Speed is a tool you use only when stealth is already blown or timing demands it. Now, this is important because water punishes noise. At low to moderate speeds, the boundary layer stays attached. The pump jet blade tips avoid cavitation thresholds, and the tonal lines, those discrete frequencies analysts love, stay low in amplitude. Push faster, you cross cavitation inception on blade edges and control surfaces. The hull flow separates, turbulence increases, and flow noise blooms across bands that trip modern towed arrays. Poseidon's reactor gives it the luxury to cruise slowly, so its designers can live in that quiet envelope for most of the mission. Depth complicates everything in a good way. The ocean isn't uniform, it's layered. Temperature and salinity build sound speed profiles with bends and lenses. The SOFAR channel, an acoustic waveguide, can carry sound for vast distances, but hanging out in or near it is a double-edged sword. If you sit in the channel, your noise can propagate far. If you tuck above or below, you can hide behind refraction. Poseidon's likely approach: cruise beneath major shipping traffic, wander outside the channel to keep self-noise bottled locally, and exploit thermoclines to bend incoming active pings away. Thermoclines are your friend when you're quiet and your enemy when you're loud. A strong seasonal layer can trap surface-generated noise above you, raising the ambient floor and letting a slow platform disappear statistically. That's the trick. You don't need to be silent. You need to be quieter than the ocean's background at the frequencies the sensors care about. Add seabed clutter, rocky shelves, canyons, gas seeps, biological choruses, and the ocean becomes a noisy room where a patient intruder can stand in a corner and blend in. But here's where it gets interesting. Deep water changes how sound bounces. Bottom composition matters. Mud absorbs, rock reflects. Slopes can refract or focus sound in odd ways. A route that hugs continental margins and zigzags across sediment types can smear the acoustic picture for fixed arrays. Even advanced tripwire systems, distributed passive nodes, seabed fiber hydrophones, and smart buoys have coverage gaps. Cables break. Storms move moorings. Fishing trawls drag sensors. The ocean fights surveillance as hard as it fights stealth. What about active sonar? Powerful low-frequency systems can search wide swathes, but they're scarce near busy coasts because they disrupt marine life and shipping. High-frequency sonars have better resolution but short range. Poseidon's size helps and hurts here. Big cross-section, yes, but if it stays deep, slow, and cold to match water temps, it shrinks contrast in many active returns, and active search in peacetime is politically constrained. You can't ping the approaches to a major port at wartime intensity for months without repercussions. Let's talk speed envelopes. A plausible cruise is in the single-digit to low-teens knots, where pump jet efficiency is high and cavitation is minimal. That's where reactor thermal output runs comfortably and cooling flows can be smoothed to avoid tonal spikes. A terminal sprint might hit higher tens of knots, but only for minutes. Why? Because that sprint announces you to every towed array within tens of miles. If the Warhead logic is arrive and detonate, there's no need to sprint until the last mile or two, if at all. More likely, the terminal phase is a controlled descent to an optimal burst depth rather than a race. Noise sources stack up even when you're careful. Coolant pumps, turbine gear harmonics, blade passing frequencies, control surface actuators, and flow over any protrusion. Designers can detune and isolate, but not erase them. The mitigation is spectral strategy. Place dominant tones in bands masked by shipping lanes or wave action. Avoid steady harmonics by dithering pump speeds slightly so the signature walks and looks natural. Use long, gentle course changes instead of hard rudder inputs to prevent flow raw. Detection architecture matters as much as platform physics. Legacy, SOSUS-like lines still exist in places, but the modern trend is distributed, sparse arrays, mobile towed systems, seabed nodes with machine learning classifiers, and opportunistic sensing from civilian infrastructure. It's a patchwork. Coverage is densest near choke points and bases. It thins along broad coastlines. A patient UUV can thread the low-density zones, especially if it uses bathymetry to shadow itself, staying downslope from a line of nodes or ducking behind a ridge that blocks direct sound paths. Everything changes when you add biology and weather. Storms jack up surface noise, masking low-frequency bands. Migratory seasons fill the water with clicks and choruses that trip false positives. A slow, autonomous intruder can wait for that chaos and move when classifiers are wobbling. This isn't sci-fi, it's basic signal-to-noise management. The Defender's challenge isn't detection in principle, it's persistent classification in practice at scales of thousands of miles without burning crews and budgets. Finally, emissions discipline. Poseidon's best defense is never transmitting. Active sonar, radio, even unnecessary valve clacks, all avoided. If it must receive updates, it does so via brief, low-power acoustic bursts from the carrier or a benign platform at standoff, timed to blend with known noise events. That keeps its RF and acoustic footprint near zero. Combine that with months of endurance, and you get the core equation. A slow, deep, quiet object leveraging ocean physics against a surveillance grid built for noisy submarines and short-duration torpedoes. That's why the Defenders worry less about chasing and more about reshaping the ocean with sensors. The Warhead, Tsunami myths and real effects. Most people latch onto the radioactive Tsunami headline, but let's separate theater from doctrine. The cobalt, salted Warhead idea, a device designed to maximize long-lived fallout by jacketing the core with cobalt-59, is mainly a fear amplifier. It shows up in leaks and media precisely because it horrifies, but it's not required to achieve the effect that matters: long-term denial of ports and coastal infrastructure. Classic doctrine prizes reliability and controllability. A salted device complicates both, adds weight, and doesn't necessarily improve the operational outcome Russia actually wants, making a harbor unusable for months or longer. So what's plausible? Yields in the high hundreds of kilotons to low multi-megaton class are consistent with the form factor and strategic role. A larger yield helps when accuracy is coarse. Water attenuates shock differently than air, and targets are spread across tanks, cranes, and basins. But yield alone isn't the trick, burst depth is. Detonate too deep and much of the energy couples into a contained plume. You get powerful local effects, but less surface damage. Go too shallow and you lose some coupling into structures, risking more prompt venting and a smaller contamination footprint. The sweet spot is a depth that drives a violent water shock, scours seabed sediments, lofts contaminated slurry, and hammers near-shore facilities with a short, steep wave and a choking debris field. Now about mega-tsunamis. Nuclear bursts in water do create waves, but they're not the transoceanic, city-high monsters of viral graphics. Tsunami-scale waves require moving colossal water volumes across vast areas, typically from seafloor displacement. A nuclear burst is an impulse event, intense but localized. You can devastate a harbor, flood adjacent low-lying districts, and swamp ships and infrastructure. But once you move beyond the local basin and continental shelf geometry, energy dissipates fast. So the wipe out the entire coastline narrative overshoots physics. The real menace is the engineered port kill, the combination of shock, debris, fires from ruptured fuel, and radioactive contamination that blocks salvage and restoration. Contamination is the slow burn weapon. A subsurface detonation entrains sediments, often already laced with industrial pollutants, and spreads radionuclides through slurry and spray. Breakwaters, dredged channels, and basin walls become catchments for hot material. Cleanup is not just deconning streets, It's dredging contaminated mud, cutting apart twisted cranes, replacing miles of rail embedded in irradiated ballast, and certifying that cargo workers, pilots, and tug crews can safely return. Even if radiation levels fall to workable thresholds, insurance underwriters and regulators can stretch that timeline. Markets hate uncertainty. A port that may be safe next quarter is effectively closed. There's also plume management. Depending on depth and local currents, you get a complex mix, a bubble pulse that drives pressure waves, vapor clouds that condense and rain out locally, and a subsurface hot layer that advects along the coast and in tidal estuaries. Ports are networked into rivers and wetlands that serve as biological sinks. That multiplies political pain, environmental litigation, fisheries shutoffs, and cross-jurisdictional fights over who pays. None of this requires a fantasy cobalt shell. A robust, dirty enough fission fusion device at the right depth near critical infrastructure does the job. Targeting logic reflects that. You don't need pinpoint detonation under Pier 12. You need to collapse container yards, flood power substations, rupture tank farms, and render ship channels uncertain. Think of how ports work. Pilots bring container ships on precise tides through dredged corridors. Cranes rely on flat, aligned rails. Gantries need power redundancy. Data centers and customs yards sit inside the fence line. A short, hard wave laden with debris and a follow-on contamination problem can take months to unwind, even without visible structural collapse. If sediment is hot, dredging pauses. If pilots refuse to enter, cargo waits at anchor. Every day costs millions. What about military bases? Naval stations cluster high-value targets, dry docks, magazines, fuel piers. A near-harbor burst can flood and contaminate dry docks, warp rails for shiplifts, and salt electrical systems with conductive dust and spray. Even if ships survive at sea, maintenance pipelines choke. Carrier strike groups can't cycle through refit on schedule. Submarine overhauls slip. Munitions loading pauses until radiological surveys clear work zones. That's operational paralysis, without leveling a city. Yield selection also ties to escalation management. A very large device broadcasts political intent. A merely large one pitched as a base killer keeps messaging calibrated, hitting military economic arteries, not civilians by design. That's how Russia threads deterrence. Threaten the thing your opponent values, trade and naval power, while framing it as restrained compared to counter-value strikes. It's still nuclear use, but it lives in that contested grey where some leaders hope bargaining remains possible. Now, one more piece people miss. Hydrology is a targeting factor. Ports vary. A wide, shallow bay with soft sediments behaves differently than a deep, narrow fjord harbor. Reflections off seawalls, resonance in basins, and outflow patterns change damage and contamination spread. Poseidon's autonomy and time on station let planners wait for tides, storms, and current phases that maximize denial and complicate cleanup. A detonation synced to an incoming tide can push contaminated water farther inland. A storm surge day multiplies debris and power failures. So no, you're not getting a continent-scale wall of water. You're getting something more strategically useful to a coercer, a tailored local catastrophe that knocks a port, and with it, supply chains, offline for months, maybe longer, while politics and insurance tangle. The fear works before the blast, the economics punish after. And that brings us to the hard question everyone asks next. If this is the real effect, can it be stopped before it reaches the harbor? Can it be stopped? The defense problem. Short answer, sometimes but not reliably, and that uncertainty is the point. The ocean is too big, sensors are too thin, and timelines are too tight. Stopping Poseidon means solving three problems at once. Find it early, classify it with confidence, and prosecute before it reaches the approaches. Miss any step and you're managing damage, not preventing it. Start with detection architecture. The Cold War's SOSUS lines taught us fixed arrays can hear far, but modern undersea awareness is a patchwork. Seabed hydrophone strings, fiber optic distributed acoustic sensing on telecom cables, mobile towed arrays on destroyers and surveillance ships, and intermittent patrols by maritime patrol aircraft dropping sonarbars. It's improving, but coverage is uneven. Choke points like Greenland, Iceland, UK, the Kurils, and gaps in the Aleutians get attention. Broad coastlines don't. Poseidon's best route is the long way around. Deep water, complex shelves, and sound channels that bend noise away from ears. Classification is the next hurdle. Machines flag contacts by patterns, tonal lines, blade passes, modulation. Poseidon's design aims to live beneath ambient, dither its pumps, and smear its spectral signature. That forces defenders to lower thresholds, which spikes false positives from biology and weather. You can't surge a response to every humpback chorus or cable strum. Practical ASW needs persistence and confidence, and both are expensive. Now prosecution. Say a node or towed array cues a sector. You still have a search box that can be tens to hundreds of square miles, shifting with currents and model errors. Surface ships can tow arrays and creep, but geometry matters. Turning circles, baffles, and self-noise limit agility. Submarines help, yet committing SSNs to long, slow barrier patrols siphons them from other missions. Aircraft can paint with active buoys, but sustained patterns near civilian traffic trigger political blowback and training fatigue. Your intercept window shrinks as the target nears the approaches, exactly where legal and economic constraints bite hardest. So what counters are even plausible? First, seabed arrays and cable sensing. Fiber optic cables can double as giant microphones via distributed acoustic sensing, detecting strain from passing acoustics. Add spaced hydrophones and you get a coarse but persistent tripwire. It helps, but you still need mobile assets to investigate, and the ocean happily breaks sensors with storms, trawlers, and landslides. Second, barrier minefields. Traditional mines struggle at depth and against quiet movers. Smart encapsulated torpedoes triggered by specific acoustic signatures are better. They're also contentious to plant in peacetime beyond territorial seas, and maintenance at depth is a bear. Third, UUV interceptors. Think of autonomous hunter-killers loitering along approaches, listening passively, then sprinting to trail and ram or trigger a close-in charge. Technically feasible, but you need numbers, queuing, and a command overlay to prevent blue-on-blue hits against friendly subs and shipping noise. Fourth, nuclear depth charges. They exist in Doctrine's attic, retired for good reasons. Detonating nuclear charges near coasts is a last resort move with political, legal, and environmental blowback that rivals the attack you're trying to prevent. It's a deterrent of desperation, not a plan. Geography offers mixed help. Choke points concentrate traffic and simplify barriers. The Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, narrow straits, and certain fjord entrances lend themselves to dense sensor curtains. But the United States and NATO have vast, open shelves and multiple approach lanes. An adversary can route around the strongest nets, accept a longer transit, and exploit seasonal thermoclines. Defenders must guard everything. The attacker needs one seat. Legal and political constraints are real. Planting dense active sonar fields and mine-like devices near foreign exclusive economic zones in peacetime invites escalation and legal fights. Even inside your own waters, constant high-power pinging collides with environmental protections and commercial interests. Ports won't tolerate months of acoustic disruption that drives out fisheries and delays traffic. The more visible and intrusive the defense, the more political capital it burns. Response timelines are the killer. A months-long transit gives the illusion of comfort, but late detection collapses the intercept window to hours or minutes. If Poseidon cruises slowly and only sprints, or simply descends, at the end, your last chance is a layered barrier inside the approaches. That means prepositioned sensors, ready ASW patrols, on-call UVs, and a clear command chain linking Navy, Coast Guard, and port authorities. Miss the handoff, and you're dealing with evacuation, harbor shutdowns, and post-blast consequence management. Or can it be stopped? Sometimes, with luck, layered sensing, and tight command relationships. More often, you'll deter deployment with credible barriers and make the attacker doubt success. That's the defense's quiet goal. Raise uncertainty, compress options, and force the adversary to fear a wasted asset or a telltale interception. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't need perfect defense to change strategy. The mere cost of building and manning these underwater fences is already a victory for the attacker. And that's exactly why Russia leans on the threat itself as a strategic tool. Strategy, coercion, deterrence, and escalation. Here's what actually matters now. Poseidon isn't just hardware, it's leverage. It gives Russia a survivable second strike option that lives outside the missile defense conversation and below the satellite warning threshold. That changes crisis bargaining. Instead of threatening cities with ICBMs, an instant leap to Armageddon, Moscow can signal, "We can make your key harbor unusable." It's still nuclear, but framed as infrastructure-centric punishment rather than countervalue annihilation. That nuance is the coercive sweet spot, brutal enough to be credible, selective enough to be thinkable. The real secret is time. Missiles compress timelines, Poseidon stretches them. A months-long autonomous approach lets Russia shape behavior before detonation. If intelligence hints a Poseidon is at sea, port authorities shift posture, insurers tighten coverage, futures markets wobble, and politicians feel heat from shippers, refineries, and unions. You get deterrence by disruption, coercion that bites economically while leaders still have choices. That makes it a theater-level tool as much as a strategic one. A shadow hanging over a campaign, complicating logistics without a launch flash. Now, this is important because escalation ladders depend on signaling. Russia can stage a sequence, publicize a Poseidon carrier's departure, leak that special payloads are aboard, and let open-source trackers do the rest. Next rung, a back-channel warning to an adversary, call off strikes on Kaliningrad or a naval base, or a port you rely on becomes unusable. Higher rung, a demonstration, underwater nuclear test far from coasts, sold as proof of capability and resolve. Each rung raises pressure, without immediately crossing into city-killing use. Deterrence credibility hinges on survivability. Poseidon's autonomy and deep roots make it harder to preempt. Even if you track Russian SSBNs, you may not find a quiet UUV already outbound. That complicates any Western scheme that imagines conventional strikes, disarming Russia's nuclear options. Moscow can hold a retaliatory card that isn't sitting in a silo or broadcasting a patrol box. For deterrence theorists, that preserves the mutual risk equation under messy conventional crises. Psychology does work here. Media will amplify radioactive tsunami headlines. Coastal communities will fixate on worst-case maps. Markets will penalize uncertainty. Russia doesn't need to drive the narrative. Open-source chatter and punditry will. The Kremlin's job is to keep ambiguity alive. Never confirm exact patrol areas, never lock down warhead yields, always hint at difficult-to-defend approaches. Ambiguity makes defense planners spend, and it makes politicians cautious. Everything changes when you consider alliance politics. NATO is a coalition of coastal economies. Threaten ports, and you don't just pressure national governments. You pull in local leaders, port operators, insurers, and labor. Suddenly, a strike on Russian assets in one theater has direct economic risk in another ally's harbor. That cross-pressure can fracture consensus or slow decision cycles, useful if your aim is to deter a coalition from escalating. But there's a knife edge. The same ambiguity that deters can also destabilize. If Washington believes a Poseidon is inbound to a major port, the pressure to act preemptively, active sonar floods, barrier mines, perhaps even kinetic strikes near another state's waters, spikes. Misread signals can trigger military moves that Moscow reads as preparation for disarming strikes, pushing both sides up the ladder. Poseidon lives in that gray zone. It promises calibrated coercion, but it also shrinks the margin for error when rumors outrun facts. So how does Russia integrate this in a fight? Think layered nuclear signaling nested inside a conventional campaign. As Russian forces absorb losses at sea or on land, strategic communications escalate. A carrier subsails. State TV airs a segment about new oceanic deterrence. Diplomats float warnings about technical measures that will make certain harbors unsafe. The goal isn't immediate use. It's to slow Western reinforcement, spike insurance and shipping rates, and force convoy-like operations that degrade tempo. If NATO logistics drag, Russia gets bargaining space. Western counters aren't just technical, they're narrative. The United States and allies will try to puncture the fear premium, public briefings on sensor nets, port resilience plans, and reinsurance backstops to keep cargo moving. That blunts coercion by assuring markets and coastal constituencies. Quietly, they'll layer defenses at key hubs to raise Russian uncertainty. The game becomes mutual doubt. Russia wants the West to fear a port kill. NATO wants Russia to fear a wasted asset and political blowback. Escalation control is the hardest part. A nuclear detonation in or near a port, military or commercial, crosses a line that invites broad retaliation. Russia knows that. The coercive value therefore sits in the pre-detonation window. The hint, the deployment, the timed leak, the private warning. If the West calls the bluff with hardened ports and continued operations, Poseidon's value drops unless Moscow is willing to cross the nuclear threshold. That's why it's a pressure device first and a warhead second. Bottom line, Poseidon adds a coercive thread to Russia's deterrence fabric, survivable, time-flexible, and aimed at economic arteries. It widens the shadow of nuclear risk over conventional crises without forcing instant apocalypse. Used skillfully, it slows enemies, splits allies, and taxes budgets. Used clumsily, it spooks markets into overreaction or pushes adversaries into dangerous preemption. That tension is exactly where Moscow wants its opponents to live, uncertain, expensive, and always one rumor away from changing course. NATO and US responses, sensors, UUVs, and policy. The West's answer starts with seeing better. Quietly, NATO navies are rebuilding fixed and semi-fixed undersea ears, modern descendants of SOSUS, but smarter. Think seabed hydrophone strings paired with fiber-optic distributed acoustic sensing that turns telecom cables into kilometer-long microphones. Add modular nodes on continental shelves, renewable-powered buoys that talk by acoustic modem, and data pipes feeding machine learning classifiers trained to spot slow, dithered pump signatures. It's not one big line. It's overlapping quilts stitched around choke points, naval bases, and high-value ports, with civilian infrastructure doubling as sensors. Now, this is important because detection is only half the problem. You need on-call hunters. Enter large displacement UUVs like the US Navy's Orca. These are not hobby drones. They're diesel-electric motherships underwater, weeks of endurance, big sonars, and the payload capacity to lay mini-nodes, tow small arrays, or carry interceptor packages. The concept is barrier teaming. SSNs sit back as high-end quarterbacks while Orcas patrol ahead, queuing surface ships, deploying smart sonarbars, or tailing anything that smells like a strategic UUV. If an unknown crosses a tripline, an Orca can shadow quietly, forcing the intruder to slow or risk exposure. Everything changes when you layer air and space. Maritime patrol aircraft push adaptive buoy fields, low-frequency active patterns during weather spikes when ambient noise hides pings, then passive grids when shipping lanes raise the noise floor. Satellites feed sea state, temperature, and chlorophyll maps into ocean models that predict where thermoclines will sit tomorrow, so commanders place sensors where sound will bend their way. This fusion makes the patchwork act coherent for hours or days at a time, enough to turn a whisper into a track. Ports are adjusting too. Hardening isn't just bollards and blast walls. It's electrical redundancy with shielded switchyards placed inland, prepositioned crane spares, and mobile harbor cranes ready to replace wrecked gantries, pre-approved dredging contracts, and clean soil staging to quickly entomb contaminated sediments, and tug and pilot dispersion plans across multiple inlets so one harbor's blackout doesn't freeze a region. Rail spurs and inland container depots expand to absorb diverted cargo, while insurers coordinate with governments on war-risk pools that keep ships sailing under elevated threat. The legal architecture gets messy fast. How do you classify a nuclear-armed autonomous UUV under arms control? It isn't a ballistic missile, it isn't a cruise missile, and it doesn't fit bomber rules. NATO policy shops and Washington lawyers are exploring carve-outs. counting rules for any strategic nuclear delivery system, regardless of trajectory, notifications for special mission subs leaving port, and transparency measures on seabed emplacement bans that extend existing seabed treaties into the era of encapsulated launchers. None of this is settled, but the conversation's signals are gold. Deny Russia the grey zone where Poseidon slips through treaty sea. Policy also has to manage peacetime friction. Running high-power active sonar near busy coasts for months will collide with environmental laws and commercial fishing. So navies are testing pulse windows, short, scheduled active sessions announced to mariners, paired with quiet stretches where passive nets and UUVs take over. The Coast Guard and civilian port authorities become part of the command web, receiving sanitized cues to adjust traffic patterns without shouting "nuclear drone" on open channels. The aim is resilience without panic. Technology bets reflect cost realities. You won't get a sensor wall from Greenland to Florida, but you can defend key approach lanes with layered quilts and roaming patrols. You won't field nuclear depth charges, but you can stock encapsulated torpedo mines that wake only on specific low-speed signatures and require multi-feature matches to arm. You can predeploy non-lethal, herder, UUVs that illuminate suspects with active tags, small pingers or dye markers underwater, so a manned sub or destroyer can take a clean shot if rules of engagement allow. Allies are dividing labor. The UK refreshes North Atlantic barriers and GIUK analytics. Norway works the Norwegian Sea's complex bathymetry. France and Spain stitch arrays across Bay of Biscay approaches. The US hedges the Pacific with Aleutian and Northern California quilts while seeding the East Coast's naval hubs. Data sharing frameworks mature, so a Portuguese cable quiver can cue a US Orca, and a Canadian buoy field can hand off to a British SSN without lawyers in the loop. Arms controllers and strategists push a parallel track, stigmatize seabed nuclear systems, extend verification to special mission hulls via port inspections and acoustic fingerprint banks, offer reciprocal observer programs for select exercises testing undersea domain awareness, lowering misread risks. Will Moscow buy in? Maybe not. But the offer itself shapes narratives and gives allies political cover to invest in sensors and UUV fleets without looking escalatory. Bottom line, NATO's response is sensors first, robots second, policy always. The goal isn't perfect interception, it's to raise Russian doubts, keep commerce moving under pressure, and close the grey spaces where a patient UUV profits. Force the attacker to assume they're seen, sometimes trailed, and maybe trapped near the approaches, and you turn Poseidon from a trump card into a risky gamble. The Achilles heel, reliability and command. Here, the floor navies don't like saying out loud. Long-duration nuclear autonomy is a reliability gauntlet. Miniaturizing a reactor isn't the hard part. Running it quietly, safely, and predictably for months in corrosive saltwater is. Liquid metal coolants can freeze if thermals aren't managed. Pressurized water systems fight pump wear, vibration, and microleaks that grow under pressure cycling. Every seal, bearing, and valve face ages in ways that stats can't perfectly predict. Biofouling adds drag and shifts flow over the pump jet, changing acoustic fingerprints mid-mission. You mitigate with conservative power settings, isolation mounts, and overbuilt plumbing, but you can't eliminate wear-out risk. Reliability is a math problem with ocean variables. Corrosion is the slow saboteur. Galvanic couples form anywhere dissimilar metals meet brackish water. Protective coatings blister, cathodic protection systems have finite life, and tiny pits become crack starters under cyclic loads. Months at depth magnify that. Radiation hardening is another treadmill. Electronics near the reactor, even shielded, absorb dose and drift off spec. Fiber optic gyros and accelerometers can tolerate dose, but connectors and power conditioners don't love it. That's why health monitoring matters. Continuous vibration analysis, coolant chemistry sampling, and spectral checks to catch bearing wear or pump cavitation early enough to slow and survive. Now command and control. Autonomy is a feature until it collides with positive control. You want dead man logic. execute the plan even if higher command is silent. But you also need aborts that can cut through chaos without being spoofed. Acoustic comms are low bandwidth and spoofable if authentication is weak. So you stack multi-factor auth, time windows, route-based geofences, and rolling codes burned into both the carrier sub and the drone. But once you lock heavy autonomy, you inherit brittleness. A misclassified seafloor ridge or outdated bathymetric tile can push the path planner into a corner case, hold position in a bad eddy, scrape a slope, or burn endurance sidestepping phantom obstacles. The fix is robust mapping and drift management. Both are hard when you refuse to surface. Navigation drift is the silent killer. Inertial systems accumulate error. Terrain contour mapping corrects, but only if the seabed map has the right resolution and hasn't changed. Landslides, trawler scars, new cable runs. GNSS is off the table underwater. Surfacing masts risk detection and icing under polar routes. Acoustic beacons help, but they must be covert and serviced, which means a support footprint that creates its own signatures. If drift exceeds arming geofence tolerances near the endgame, the Warhead may refuse to arm. A safe failure that still squanders a strategic asset. Spoofing and decoys are a quieter threat. Distributed acoustic nodes can transmit deceptive cues, fake aborts, false depth limits, or phantom obstacles if they crack authentication or exploit sensor physics. Autonomy tries to cross-check against onboard models, but high ambiguity environments, storm noisy thermoclines, biologically loud shelves, raise error bars. A cautious autonomy will slow, loiter, and burn time. An aggressive one risks exposure. Either outcome benefits the defender. Bottlenecks make it worse. Russia doesn't have infinite carriers. Belgorod and the Khabarovsk line are special purpose, high-value assets with basing you can watch from space. Their peers, support ships, and nuclear handling facilities are attractive targets for sanctions, sabotage, or conventional strikes in a crisis. Maintenance cycles are long, dry dock slots are finite, specialized crews are small. Production scaling for the UUVs themselves hits the same wall. Reactor cores, radiation shielding, precision pump jet components, and pressure hull sections compete with other naval priorities. Each additional unit drags scarce talent and factory time away from SSNs, SSBNs, and cruise missile subs. Secrecy amplifies accident risk. When programs compartmentalize to protect crown jewels, safety lessons travel slowly. You've seen hints in other Russian deep-sea programs. Fires, test site explosions, recovery mishaps, where messaging stayed murky. A reactor that scrams in mid-mission forces safe mode behavior, slow drift, depth change, or a park-and-wait routine that could end on a foreign seabed, inviting a media circus or covert salvage. Even a non-nuclear failure, a stuck control surface or jammed pump, can leave a dead object in a shipping lane or near a cable farm, telegraphing presence and compromising future routes. And there's the human loop. Positive political control over nuclear use demands reliable arming chains. If you push too much autonomy downward, you risk a weapon that detonates under misunderstood local conditions. If you keep too much control at the top, you risk a mute asset when comms are jammed or leadership is disrupted. The design compromise, time-locked arming with multi-parameter environmental checks, reduces accidental use, but increases the chance of mission aborts at the last mile. Bottom line, Poseidon's power comes with fragile edges. Reactor reliability, corrosion management, autonomy brittleness, navigation drift, and thin production and basing pipelines. The ocean forgives nothing, and secrecy hides not just capability but errors. Those constraints don't make the system a bluff. They make it an imperfect lever that can jam at the worst moment, and that's a strategic vulnerability. Accidents, tests, and the shadow record. The shadow record around Russian deep-sea programs tells you how messy this gets. Take Losharik, the ultra-deep diving mini-sub that caught fire in 2019. Officially, it was research. Unofficially, it was a stark reminder that high-end, compartmentalized undersea projects carry brittle safety margins. The crew died fighting a fire in a battery compartment. The secrecy around the mission slowed clear reporting and probably slowed lessons learned diffusion. Different platform, same ecosystem. Nuclear work, exotic materials, tiny crews, and mission urgency. That environment is where Poseidon is born and tested. Now, this is important because deep programs cross-pollinate. The same bureaus that design special-purpose hulls and handle under-ice navigation also touch reactor miniaturization, high-pressure housings, and acoustic isolation. When one program burns down time and people, the others feel it. Losharik's loss pulled a core of elite officers and engineers off the board. It also forced audits across the special mission fleet. Audits slowed test tempo. A weapon like Poseidon needs long, quiet trials. Safety pauses, and crew churns stretch calendars. Then there's Nyanoxa, also in 2019. An explosion near a White Sea test site that produced a radiation spike and a confusing official narrative about isotope power sources. Many analysts tied it to a Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile effort, not Poseidon, but the takeaway for our purposes is the same. Handling compact nuclear systems at sea and along the coast is peril-prone, politically sensitive, and quickly wrapped in ambiguity. After Nyanoxa, medical responders were reportedly kept in the dark about radiation exposure. Secrecy shielded program details. It also compounded risk. Sparse public test data is a feature, not a bug. Russia signals capability through curated clips, carrier submarines sailing, tubes visible, a short underwater launch snippet, a presidential line about a reactor brought to power. That's deliberate. You get enough to believe the concept is real, not enough to map performance envelopes. Western outlets grab the reactor-activated phrasing, Russian channels amplify. Meanwhile, the actual reliability work, shakedowns for coolant pumps, vibration management, navigation drift trials, happens off-camera or in lakes and closed bays where outside sensing is hard. Open-source intelligence tries to fill the gaps. Satellite imagery tracks Belgorod's movements and spots odd barges and pontoon rigs near northern ranges. AIS gaps around support ships hint at exclusion zones. Seabed disturbance patterns near known ranges sometimes show up in commercial bathymetry updates. None of it nails down a full Poseidon end-to-end, firing with a live warhead, but together it sketches a program steadily ticking boxes: launch, propulsion, guidance, and carrier integration. But here's where it gets interesting. Ambiguity is itself a deterrent multiplier. If you're a NATO planner, you don't need video of a full-yield underwater test to worry. You need plausible milestones and a leadership willing to brandish them. Russia can claim operational testing while never risking a catastrophic public failure. If a trial vehicle scrams its reactor and goes to the bottom, you classify, you mount a recovery, and you control the narrative. If a test succeeds, you leak selectively. Either way, outsiders live with partial pictures. Accidents still leak through the membrane. Fishermen snag unusual debris. Regional radiation monitors blip above background. Local news reports on unusual cordons and helicopters. Those breadcrumbs, combined with design drawings and patent filings that sometimes surface, let analysts triangulate. You get educated guesses about pump jet dimensions, pressure hull segmentation, and thermal footprints. You also get noise, fake documents, speculative renders, and misattributed sightings, often seeded by actors who benefit from confusion. The lesson from the shadow record is restraint. Assume progress without assuming perfection. Expect more controlled shows of capability and more elastic timelines than headlines suggest. And remember the deeper point from Losharik and Nyanoxa. Secrecy preserves deterrence ambiguity, but it also incubates accidents. In a real crisis, that mix, real capability, limited tests, and brittle safety, narrows margins for everyone. Scenario: the night Poseidon is used as leverage. It starts with a rumor. A Russian special-purpose sub slips past the Barents under weather front, and open-source trackers notice a gap. A state TV anchor tosses a line about oceanic deterrence on patrol, and an unclassified maritime advisory quietly circulates to port operators on the US East Coast. Review blackout procedures, validate radiological survey kits, rehearse channel closure drills. No alarms, just a shift in posture that everyone pretends not to notice. By evening, insurers hold an emergency call. War risk premiums nudge up for a handful of approach lanes. Terminal operators in Norfolk, New York, New Jersey, and Savannah quietly delay night arrivals, citing harbor safety. Tug companies pass word to keep AIS on and chatter down. The Coast Guard issues a bland notice to mariners about hazardous operations, which sounds routine until pilots get text messages to carry dosimeters and be ready for a dark port evolution. On cable news, a graphic labeled Undersea Threat flashes once and vanishes. Back-channel lines go live. In Brussels and Washington, diplomats hear the same phrase from Russian intermediaries. Call-off plan strikes on Russian naval units and logistics nodes, or a harbor you rely on becomes unusable. It's deliberately vague. No city named, no timeline given, but it's specific enough to change conversations. Combatant commanders push to proceed. Civilian leaders ask for confidence levels. Intel chiefs hedge. A Poseidon patrol is plausible, detection is uncertain, and interception timelines, if it exists, would be tight. This is where market pressure does the work. Futures wobble for fuel and container shipping. A major line announces a temporary reroute to Halifax out of caution, forcing trucking firms to recalc delivery windows and unions to flag overtime. Governors call the White House about economic impact. Port authority boards convene after hours with Navy liaisons. Every stakeholder wants clarity that doesn't exist. That fog is leverage. Inside the Pentagon, the wargame branches. Option A, call the bluff. Keep strikes on schedule, announce layered undersea surveillance, and move additional ASW assets to key approaches. Risk. If the weapon is real and inbound, you compress response time and own the consequences. Option B, signal restraint. Pause the strike package 48 hours, flood the approaches with low-frequency active pings, seed sonar fields, and push Orca-type UUVs into barrier patrols. Risk, you reward coercion, and Moscow learns the pressure point works. Option C, demonstrate. Detonate a large conventional depth munition far offshore as a message, we see you, and release sanitized sonar spectrograms that suggest a track. Risk, misinterpretation, escalation, and revealing sensor tricks. Meanwhile, at sea, destroyers tow their big arrays in tight racetracks. An SSN parks in a canyon outside a major harbor, listening for anything with a steady, dithered pump signature. Maritime patrol aircraft fly patterns that look like they're hunting a submarine, because they are. Coastlines that usually hum with AIS dots go oddly sparse as pilots hold outside the 12-mile limit. A few cruise ships delay departures, citing weather on a clear night. The optics alone change public mood. Then a false positive hits a control room. A fiber optic cable's acoustic sensing lights up with a low-speed contact. A classifier flags probable UUV. An ASW commander has minutes to decide whether to drop active, which spooks shipping and advertises tactics, or hold passive and risk losing the trail. They ping. The return blooms ugly, big, slow, and deep, until a biologist on the watch floor recognizes a whale chorus refracted under a thermocline. Relief mixes with embarrassment. The story still leaks by morning. Now comes the message. A mediator passes a note. You have hours, not days. Moscow hints at a demonstration detonation, far from coasts. That's a classic ladder step, proof of capability, not an attack. Washington's deputies debate whether a new underwater nuclear test, illegal in spirit if not letter, can be ignored. Allies split. A northern European capital urges de-escalation. A Baltic state says press on and call the bluff. A Pacific ally warns that backing down here sets a precedent. Decision windows shrink. If leaders believe there's a small chance a Poseidon is parked off a harbor, every hour of delay feels prudent to some and dangerous to others. Intelligence pushes probability bands. Unlikely in this sector, possible in that canyon, unknown beyond. Lawyers surface with authorities for harbor closures and emergency radiological sweeps. Port police rehearse cordons at substation yards and fuel farms. A governor pre-drafts a statement about temporary precautionary measures, hoping never to use it. Here's the twist. The pressure lands hardest before anything detonates. Insurers write exclusions for certain approaches, then soften them if the government provides backstop guarantees. That buys time. The Navy announces enhanced undersea domain awareness operations without saying where. Russia airs a clip of Belgorod loading anonymous cylindrical payloads, then shows a chart of ocean currents near North America. Nothing is confirmed, but everyone understands. Two branches diverge. In one, the West holds firm, conducts a limited strike package anyway, and floods the approaches with sensors. Russia grumbles, airs more clips, and the crisis cools without a blast. The lesson: layered defense and financial backstops blunt coercion. In the other, a sensor quilt catches something real, a slow, persistent contact with a signature just different enough from biology. UUV interceptors move. A destroyer drops an encapsulated torpedo mine in a narrow approach, and port ops shift to blackout for 12 tense hours. Moscow claims it never intended use, then declares victory. You blinked. Either way, the strategy is revealed. Poseidon's leverage lives in the rumor, the open loop, the financial pinch, and the clock. It turns a conventional dispute into a whole-of-society stress test overnight, without lighting the sky. And that's the part most planners fear, the night when uncertainty itself does the coercion.